Welcome to Greek for a Week. We are looking at the next two verses of the paragraph in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. So we're going to consider verses 3 and 4. We're still in the paragraph that is described as Paul's example of ministry. So this is the opportunity where Paul demonstrates to the Thessalonians how he entered into Thessalonica. So it goes back to verse 10 and then pushes on into verses 1 through 12 of chapter 2. So he's demonstrating what he has done as he entered into Thessalonica. So we learn in verses 1 and 2 that he was bold to preach the gospel. Now we're going to see in verses 3 and 4 how exactly he came to preach the gospel. What did that look like? So if you'll look at verse 3 here and then verse 4. Verse 3, he says, "For our exhortation does not come from air or from impurity or by the means of deceit, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. So we speak not as pleasing to men, but to God, the one who examines our hearts." So a lot's going on in this particular text, especially, again, how Paul uses contrasting explanations to bring about the purity of what it is that they spoke, number one, and then how they spoke. So you have a gar here in verse 3, so that would be explanatory. So that's going to continue to explain verses 1 and 2. So we're looking at more explanation. It's interesting here, the word ek as well as ex, both of those I would contend mean from, but they're indicating source. In other words, the exhortation is not sourced in air, nor is it sourced in impurity. And then he concludes here with the en dalo. That is also the exhortation did not come by the means of deceit. So the avenue or the instrument that this exhortation came was not through deceit. But, and then here's our strong contrast. We're going to see that twice in this verse. But, okay, the strong contrast, it was not in impurity, not in error, but we speak. But what did we do? We spoke. So the masmetha, this verb here is in the perfect tense form. It's first person plural, perfect active indicative of dakimazo. And basically he's saying here with the perfect tense form, they are in the state of being approved by God. So being approved simply means that God has approved them to preach the gospel, and that is currently the state in which they are in. Then he continues with an infinitive here, to be entrusted. It's complementary infinitive. We have been approved by God. You could say to do what? Well, here's our complementary infinitive, and this complementary infinitive completes or complements the action of the main verb, which is right here. Then he continues the la lumen, of course, what it is that they've been entrusted to do, and that is to speak the gospel. So this is first person plural, present active indicative of laleo. Well, remember that laleo, you have an epsilon here as the last vowel or the last letter of the stem. So when I have amen attached on the verb, you have an epsilon here and you have an omicron right here. So that's why you have umen. You have the circumflex over the upsilon there to indicate that there's a contraction that's taking place. And then lastly, actually two things here. You have another Allah here, so you have another strong contrast. They have not been speaking as pleasing to men, but what have they been speaking to God? And then who is God? He further defines them as the to dakimazanti, present active participle, singular dative masculine here of dakimazo, and that's just simply an attributive participle. It is God who examines our hearts. So that's verses 3 and 4 as Paul continues with his explanation of what his ministry and how he ministered to the Thessalonians takes place. Have a great week.